The marble halls of the United Nations have echoed with countless speeches, most of them polished, diplomatic, and quickly forgotten. But every now and then a voice rises that cuts through the rehearsed pleasantries and dares to tell the truth. Recently, that voice belonged to India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. He did not arrive to flatter the powerful. He came with a message that struck at the very heart of today's broken world order. When he began not with India but with Bharat, he did more than greet the assembly, he reclaimed identity. He reminded the world that names matter, that refusing the language of colonizers is itself an act of sovereignty. And for us in Africa, this was not just symbolism, it was a lesson. How many of our nations still carry borders drawn by outsiders, names that erase our past systems imposed upon us without consent? Jaishankar's words were a mirror exposing the hypocrisy of a United Nations in crisis, the silence over forgotten wars in Africa, the injustice of pandemic discrimination, and the manipulation of global supply chains. He dared to call terrorism by its name rather than hide behind euphemisms. He spoke of sovereignty not as a privilege, but as a right. For Africa, his speech was not just about India, it was about us. It was about every village in the Sahel abandoned by global media, every child denied equal access to vaccines, every community forced to beg for resources it already owns. It was a call to wake up, to realize that self-reliance, self-defense, and self-confidence are not luxuries, they are survival. So I ask you, is Africa ready to follow this path? Are we prepared like Jaishankar to speak truth to power without apology, to say no when the system demands our silence? If you believe Africa's future must be written by Africans, not dictated from outside, then stay with us. Please share this message if you feel among the first to recognize this change, and subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. The United Nations General Assembly is often described as the world's grand stage, but for many nations of the global south it has long been a stage where their voices are muted, their concerns ignored, and their realities overshadowed. That is why the recent address by India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar struck like a thunderclap. His words were not diplomatic niceties designed to please the powerful. They were a direct indictment of the failures of the global order, and they carried a resonance that stretched from Asia to the heart of Africa. From the very first moment, Jaishankar set the tone. Instead of bowing to colonial conventions, he greeted the assembly with namaskar from Bharat. It was more than a formality, it was an act of reclamation. By affirming Bharat, he rejected the imposed colonial label and declared the right of civilizations to define themselves. For Africans, this small but powerful choice carried deep meaning. We too know how much power lies in names. To name oneself is to assert one's identity. To be named by another is to live under their shadow. In that single gesture, Jaishankar gave the Global South permission to stop apologizing for who we are. His speech then turned to the state of the United Nations itself. With unflinching clarity, he declared, "An objective report card will show that the UN is in a state of crisis." These words landed with force because they echoed what so many smaller nations have whispered for decades, that the very institution designed to embody equality has become a guardian of inequality. For African nations, this was validation long overdue. We have seen countless resolutions ignored, countless interventions justified in the name of peace that brought only exploitation. To hear a major power say it aloud was electrifying. When Jaishankar spoke about the world's conflicts, he pointed out something that Africans have known in their bones, that some wars receive round-the-clock media coverage while others are erased from global consciousness. Ukraine and the Middle East dominate headlines, while massacres in the Sahel, in Congo, in Somalia barely merit a paragraph. This selective attention is not neutral. It decides whose lives are valued and whose are forgotten. His words pierced that silence, reminding the assembly that the suffering of one people should never eclipse the suffering of another. Perhaps most striking was his courage in addressing terrorism. Without euphemisms or evasions, he called out the fact that India's neighbor has become an epicenter of global terrorism. That kind of bluntness is rare in diplomatic halls, but it was refreshing. For Africans living in the shadow of extremist violence, especially in the Sahel, the message was clear: it is possible to speak honestly about threats without hiding behind polite fictions. We too must learn to describe our reality without fear, for only truth can form the basis of genuine security. In this way, Jaishankar's words were not only a critique of others, they were also an invitation to the global South to adopt a new diplomatic posture, direct, unapologetic, principled. He showed that it is possible to be diplomatic and truthful at once, to be respectful without surrendering, to be internationalist without erasing national pride. Every line of his speech was a reminder that the crisis of our age is not only one of violence, pandemics, or economics. It is a crisis of representation. The global South has been treated as a periphery, but Jaishankar's voice insisted that we are central, that without us the system collapses under its own hypocrisy. And in echoing that truth, Africans could feel our own unspoken experiences finding words at last. This was the heart of the event, a speech that refused to flatter, refused to apologize, and refused to remain silent. It was a speech that reminded us all, India, Africa, and the wider global South, that justice begins when we dare to tell the truth. The turning point of Dr. Jaishankar's address, the moment when the hall seemed to shift from polite listening to stunned recognition, came when he confronted the world with its conduct during the pandemic. With measured but unmistakable anger, he reminded the assembly how nations of the global South were denied equal access to vaccines, how African populations became testing grounds for experimental treatments, and how travel bans were imposed on our citizens while Western countries facing the same crisis were spared such humiliation. This was not abstract rhetoric. It was lived memory. In Africa, we remember watching planes full of vaccines land in Europe while our hospitals ran out of oxygen. We remember being told to wait our turn while our elderly and vulnerable died. We remember how aid arrived with conditions, lectures, and strings attached. When Jaishankar declared that the pandemic revealed the persistence of neo-colonial attitudes in international relations, he spoke what so many of us have felt but rarely heard acknowledged by a leader from a major power. The hall grew heavier with truth. From there, he moved to expose the subtler mechanisms of domination, economic manipulation, technological control, and weaponized supply chains. This was not the old colonialism of occupying armies, but a more insidious system, algorithms and patents, financial rules and shipping restrictions that can choke a nation's growth without firing a shot. For Africa, these words cut deeply. How many times have our exports been blocked under the pretense of standards? How many of our young innovators have been locked out of global platforms because the keys are held in Silicon Valley or Brussels? Jaishankar's critique resonated as an indictment not only of the past, but of the present. And then came his answer, the philosophy of Atmanirbhar, Atmaraksha, Atmavishwas, self-reliance, self-defense, self-confidence. These were not slogans, they were a roadmap. He explained that self-reliance does not mean isolation, but intelligent interdependence, building your own capacity so that partnerships are chosen, not imposed. Self-defense does not end at armies and weapons. It extends to sovereignty of values, resources, and decision-making. And self-confidence is the anchor that allows a nation to face the world not as a supplicant, but as an equal. For Africans listening, this was the emotional peak of the address, because these three principles could have been written for us. Self-reliance. Why must Africa remain the exporter of raw minerals and the importer of finished goods? Self-defense. Why must our sovereignty be compromised whenever we choose partners outside of Washington, Paris, or London? Self-confidence. Why do we forget that this is the continent of the Nile, of Timbuktu, of Great Zimbabwe, the cradle of humanity and knowledge? Jaishankar was not speaking to India alone. His words were a mirror in which Africa could see its own reflection, scarred but unbroken, ready to rise. The reactions in the hall were telling. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably, those whose nations benefited from the inequities he exposed. Others nodded quietly, grateful that someone had spoken aloud what they dared not say. Among the global South, there was a sense of vindication. Finally, one of the world's major voices had said what needed to be said. Among Africans especially, the speech was both a wound reopened and a balm offered. It hurt to remember the indignities of the pandemic, but it healed to know we had not been forgotten. By confronting the hypocrisy of the global system while offering a framework for dignity and survival, Jaishankar lifted the speech from mere critique to genuine leadership. This was the high point, the moment when hope and anger, memory and vision all collided into a single demand that the global South stop waiting for fairness and start building it. Every powerful speech leaves echoes, and Dr. Jaishankar's words reverberated far beyond the walls of the UN. For nations of the Global South, especially in Africa, the implications were both civil and political. His message was not simply about India's pride. It was about rewriting the terms of engagement for billions of people who have too long been treated as spectators in a game that decides their fate. On the civil front, the consequences begin with dignity. When a leader of a major power admits openly that the world order is biased and discriminatory, it validates the lived experiences of ordinary Africans. Communities in the Sahel, families in Congo, workers in West Africa, people who have suffered in silence now see that their struggles are acknowledged on the world stage. This validation is not a small thing. Dignity is the seed of civic empowerment. It inspires citizens to demand more from their governments, to believe that injustice is not inevitable, and to trust that international institutions can be challenged. Politically, Jaishankar's call for reforming the UN Security Council hit the deepest nerve. Africa, with more than 1 billion people, remains without a permanent seat at the table where wars are authorized and sanctions decided. We are the continent most affected by Security Council decisions, yet we are voiceless in its chambers. When Jaishankar insisted that this historical injustice must end, he spoke not just as India's envoy, but as an ally of Africa. The consequence is clear. The push for representation is no longer a regional grievance. It is now part of a global demand for justice. His emphasis on self-reliance, self-defense, and self-confidence carries its own set of political repercussions. For African governments, it poses a challenge to stop leaning on aid packages that come with strings to defend sovereignty against foreign dictates and to cultivate pride in our civilizations as sources of strength. These are not abstract ideals. They demand concrete policies, investment in local industries, protection of resources, education systems that affirm cultural heritage. The civil consequence is a population less willing to accept dependency. The political consequence is leadership under pressure to deliver independence in action, not only in rhetoric. Another major implication lies in South-South cooperation. By citing India's 600 development projects across 78 countries, Jaishankar demonstrated that solidarity is not a slogan but a practice. For Africa, the lesson is stark. We have too often looked northward for aid while ignoring what we can build together across the Global South. The political consequence is the possibility of reorienting alliances, moving away from dependency on Western capitals toward partnerships rooted in equality and mutual benefit. Yet there is also a deeper civil impact. Jaishankar's philosophy of Atmavishwas, self-confidence, reminds Africans that identity and history are political tools. To teach a child in Ouagadougou or Nairobi that Africa is the cradle of civilization is not nostalgia, it is preparation. A confident generation will no longer accept being portrayed as the developing world in need of saving. Instead, they will demand their rightful role as co-authors of the global future. In short, the speech marked a civil awakening and a political realignment. It told ordinary citizens that their grievances are valid. It told governments that sovereignty must be defended, not bartered. And it told the world that Africa is no longer a passive object of international relations, but a subject ready to speak, act, and lead. For Washington and its Western allies, Dr. Jaishankar's address was not just another speech from the Global South, it was a warning shot. By exposing the hypocrisy of pandemic policies, by naming the failures of the UN, and by demanding a Security Council that finally includes Africa, he challenged the very architecture of power that the United States and Europe have relied upon since 1945. From the American perspective, this challenge is deeply unsettling. The U.S. has long positioned itself as the defender of democracy and fairness, yet Jaishankar reminded the world that fairness has been selective and democracy often imposed. His words suggest that the old narrative where the West lectures and the South listens is collapsing. For the first time, a major Southern power is not only speaking back, but offering a coherent alternative, one rooted in dignity, solidarity, and multipolar cooperation. In Europe, the reaction is equally complicated. Nations like France and the UK, which still see parts of Africa as their sphere of influence, cannot easily accept a world where the Global South dictates terms. Jaishankar's critique of neo-colonial attitudes during COVID was especially uncomfortable for them. By highlighting discriminatory travel bans and vaccine hoarding, he called out the very policies that revealed Western double standards. The civil consequence is global embarrassment. The political consequence is the erosion of moral authority that Europe has long claimed. But the most profound global impact lies in how the speech reframes alliances. Jaishankar did not call for India to replace Western dominance with Indian dominance. He called for a new kind of multilateralism, better multilateralism, inclusive and representative. For Africa, this signals an opening partnerships with India and other southern nations could become the foundation of a new world order. For the U.S., this means its traditional leverage aid sanctions military presence may no longer guarantee influence if nations can find solidarity elsewhere. This shift also resonates beyond the halls of power. Around the world, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and across the African continent, smaller nations heard a validation of their struggles. The fact that Jaishankar's words carried the weight of a rising major economy makes them harder to dismiss. His call for reform is not a plea from the margins. It is a demand from the center of the 21st century global economy. For Africa, the U.S. angle raises pressing questions. Washington has already shown anxiety over Burkina Faso's refusal to bow to Western dictates over Mali and Niger, joining new alliances over President Ibrahim Traoré's unapologetic rhetoric of sovereignty. Now, with India amplifying the same themes on the world stage, the message is undeniable. The Global South is uniting around principles that run counter to Western dominance. The world is watching. Some see danger fragmentation, the collapse of Western-led institutions, the rise of rival blocs. Others see hope, justice, long-delayed voices, long silenced finally being heard, and a more balanced world where no nation holds a monopoly on truth. Whether the U.S. responds with humility and adaptation or with resistance and fear will shape the decades to come. Dr. Jaishankar's speech at the United Nations was more than a moment of eloquence. It was a line drawn in the sand. By exposing hypocrisy, by reclaiming identity, and by demanding justice for Africa and the Global South, he reminded the world that the current order is neither natural nor permanent. It is a system built by power, and like all systems built by power, it can be rebuilt by courage. For Africa, this is both an inspiration and a warning. Inspiration because we have heard, in Jaishankar's words, the validation of our lived experience, the forgotten wars, the pandemic, humiliations, the chains of dependency. Warning, because speeches alone cannot change realities. If Africa does not seize this moment, others will write our story for us yet again. The world is shifting. The old categories of first and third world are dissolving. What matters now is whether nations have the vision to stand on their own feet, the courage to speak truth to power, and the solidarity to walk together. India has shown one path. The question is whether Africa will follow, not as a copy but as a partner with its own proud voice. We must remember sovereignty is not a gift. It is a responsibility. Representation at the UN Fair Trade Dignity in Crises, these are not favors to be begged for. They are rights to be claimed. If Africa continues to wait for permission, we will be waiting another century. But if we move with confidence, self-defense, and unity, we can reshape the global order itself. And here lies the deeper message for us all. The next chapter of history will not be written in Washington, Brussels, or Beijing alone. It will be written in Ouagadougou, in New Delhi, in Bamako, in Johannesburg. It will be written wherever nations of the Global South decide that enough is enough and that the time to lead has come. So let me ask you directly, do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective, yet can Africa trust leaders like him to carry this vision forward, or must new voices rise to share the burden? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Comment below with your thoughts, because this conversation belongs to all of us. And subscribe if you believe, as we do, that the truth is more important than the headlines. The time for change is now. The leaders for change are already here. The only question is whether we will stand with them or remain silent as history passes us by.